It's my pleasure to welcome Brian Villmoare here. Brian's a well-known evolutionary anthropologist who has written a recent book, which Brian Smith has read and recommended. I've not yet gone around to it, but I look forward to it. Brian is speaking from Arizona and is going to talk on war, politics, and evolution, and evolutionary and biology, I beg your pardon, an evolutionary anthropologist perspective. Welcome, Brian. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
All right, thanks. And you can hear me okay? And you can see the screen? Okay. So just to give a real brief introduction of who I am and what my scientific background is, I'm a paleoanthropologist. So I basically go to Ethiopia and Kenya and look for bones and then analyze the bones and try to make inferences about our past based on those. So that's my specialty. The talk today is not on that at all. So I'm working outside of my area of expertise. I'm also a professor and I teach students, and I saw a gap in their understanding of the world. And so that is what the book was designed to address. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But the book specifically is not in my area of expertise. It's more of a digest of an evolutionary anthropologist perspective on a lot of other things. So let's see here. So just because I'm going to be talking about history, I wanted to talk very briefly about history itself. In general, today history is treated in one particular way. But if you look at the past, there was a time when people attempted to draw broader inferences about historical patterns. So Toynbee, Spengler, Hegel, and most recently Jared Diamond. Today, Jared Diamond is the only one who still does it, and he is not a historian. He's actually an anthropologist. So if you've read his books, Gun, Germs, and Steel, or Collapse, he is taking information across a sort of a group of disciplines and trying to make inferences about humanity over a fairly deep time using that information. And that's what I attempt to do. In general today, historians don't try to do that. And I have corresponded with a group of historians, and of course, I walk up to the history department at the university and ask them, so what exactly do you do? And they actually don't agree what they do, but they do agree that they employ something called narrative. And a narrative is a way to connect events in history, theoretically attempting to get at why one event would lead to the next event. So you have a series of events, they follow each other, and you're attempting to understand why they followed each other. What are the causal factors that drive these events to occur? And so someone's microphone is on. I don't know if I should intervene to mention that or not. Looks like I hear a ping. Okay. And I wanted to give an example of the way historians treat phenomena in the past. Most of you are probably familiar with the American Civil War, and this is just a map I downloaded off Google. And you can see those little red splotches are where the battles were. Historians treat Gettysburg, which is the northernmost splotch, with special significance because it is the furthest north that the Confederacy ever got. And the trope is that the South never lost a battle before Gettysburg and never won a battle after Gettysburg. So Gettysburg has this special significance for historians, and it's typically treated as sort of a pivotal moment. Now, people, of course, study Gettysburg at great length. They want to know the tactics and the strategy of all of that. And they will focus on certain aspects of the battle. And one that has received a special focus was this battle on Little Round Top, in which the Confederacy attempted, so you can see the bottom here, they attempted to get around behind the Union line. So if you see the Little Round Top, and see my cursor there, right? So they were trying to get behind and basically attack the North from the back, right? So sort of a sweeping maneuver. And they were defended by this group from Maine under this guy, Joshua Chamberlain. And historians have focused on him as a pivotal person who, in a sense, saved the Civil War for the North. And they've even gone so far as to focus on the fact that he was a rhetoric professor at the University of Massachusetts, and he was able to persuade his men who had run out of ammunition to attack and drive this sort of sweeping motion of the Confederacy down the hill. And there are a lot of paintings of it. Um, and so people treat him and this moment as especially important. And he is a character who is, in a such a special person. And this was a special event in the war, right? So it changed the momentum of the war. And this idea that that the past can be treated as a narrative with heroes also has been applied to human evolution. So Misa Landau wrote this book, Human Evolution as a Narrative, which I highly recommend. And then McBrearty and Brooks went back and looked at some of the technological changes from about, let's say, 300,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. And they argued that this idea of a revolution and treating humanity in the model of this hero myth, much the way historians did and do, misrepresents the past. So they were saying that humans have this instinct to look for important people or people that they can relate to and view the past through that lens. And they argue that this is not an accurate way to view history. And actually, McBrearty and Brooks, if you ever have a chance to read that paper, I highly one of my favorite paleoanthropology papers of all time. They said this is not what happened. They argued that it was simply demographics, and they took a very sort of systematic and scientific view on the change of technology through our past. And you can do this for history as well. So there are some historians who do this, economic historians primarily, who would, for example, look at the Civil War through the lens of economics. And they would say, okay, let's look at the economies of those two, and you can treat them as different states. And you can see here in this graph, so the South only had advantages in cotton and large farms. In virtually every other economic metric, the North was far, far more powerful. So then you might ask yourself, how often have agriculturally based countries defeated industrial countries in open warfare? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is never. So even though we might think Joshua Chamberlain was heroic in his behavior, treating Gettysburg as a significant event clouds the fact that sooner or later the North was going to win. It didn't really matter what battle it was. It could have been Antietam, the battle before, or it could have been a subsequent battle. But sooner or later, the South was going to run out of resources, and the North was just simply going to win because it had more steel, more railroads, more industrial capacity, and a much larger population. So this tends to de-emphasize the importance of individuals in history. And you can do this in the history of science as well. So several important scientific events were discovered at the same time by people with similar backgrounds. So you probably know that both Newton and Leibniz were working on calculus at the same time, just as Darwin and Wallace were working on evolution by natural selection at the same time. This is not likely to be a coincidence. There was probably a body of knowledge in the societies at those times that led people with those interests and who were relatively intelligent to come to those conclusions at that time. So this de-emphasizes the sort of hero model to look at history this way. If you guys know that quote by Carlyle, history, what do you say? It was this: history is the history of the world is the history of great men, just to paraphrase. And so this contradicts the sort of great man model of history. So that's just sort of a little bit of a background to the way I view history. Now I want to talk a little bit about the the way biologists view history, not just scientists. And so I'm going to be talking naturally about evolutionary influences on human behavior. And that means I have to talk about sociobiology. Now, sociobiology, some of you probably are familiar with the history of it. It was developed by E.O. Wilson, who was a Harvard entomologist in the 70s. He was looking at ants. So he looked at complex ant behavior, and he said, nothing that an ant does with its 250,000 neurons can really be the product of learning. It's in all likelihood to be entirely the product of genetics. And he said that it's trivially true that this is true in ants, but he also said that it's probably likely to be true for some behaviors or instincts in humans. So you can take a range of behaviors, animal and human, and there's a continuum, right? So obviously, every aspect of the Hobie Eagle dance is learned. But if you look at sea turtles, right? So a mother sea turtle lays her eggs, goes out into the sea. The baby sea turtles are born. They never meet their parents, right? All of their behaviors are essentially instinctual. They're hatched. They dig their way out of the sand. They aim for the moon over the water, and they just go right down and start swimming. So none of that is learned because there's no one teaching it to them. So there's this continuum of behaviors in animals and humans, and a range of contributions of both culture and genetics, or learning and genetics, to those behaviors. Now, so most of you are probably old enough to remember the 70s, when people were arguing about ideas of essentialism. So, this sort of fit in the 70s into a debate over what it meant to be a human. So this is during the failure of the American feminists to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, largely because of the states in the South. And you ran up against people like this, who were not making a biological argument for essentialism. This is Phyllis Schlafly. She said that that there was an essential behavior for women, all right? That it was, but it was not, it wasn't biological, but it was sort of religiously based. But you get this idea that that people are arguing that human behavior is on the continuum of what they inherently should do or what they are simply taught to do. And this played into this huge debate about sociobiology, whether or not human behavior was learned or genetically driven. It got its way into the popular media. You can see Time magazine there, and all these debates about it. Marshall Solins, you see the use and abuse of biology within anthropology, especially. This continues to be a strong debate. And as recently as, I'm going to say it's 2007, the Stanford anthropology department actually split into cultural anthropologists and biological anthropologists. They actually had to move to separate buildings. Maybe it was earlier than 2007, because they simply couldn't agree on this issue and couldn't even agree to be in the same building with each other. And this played out within evolutionary biology. So you're probably familiar with Richard Dawkins. He's still alive today. He argued strongly that there is a genetic basis to some elements of human behavior, agreeing with E.O. Wilson. On the other side, you had Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, who argued that human behavior was essentially too complex to apply evolutionary models to. I personally regard that as a form of special pleading. I don't think that they were especially persuasive. They were especially worried about returning to some sort of eugenics model for humans. So within anthropology, this played out in a really interesting way in the 90s. So in the 80s and 90s. So this anthropologist on the left, he is a cultural, actually he just died. He was a cultural anthropologist. His name is Napoleon Chagnon, pronounced that way. He studied the Yanomamo in Venezuela. And he, in the course of studying this group of people, discovered that fiercer, more aggressive warriors, and the Yanomamo are that the fiercer, more aggressive warriors have more offspring than those that are less aggressive. Now they are a hunter-gatherer group living in the rainforest. They raid each other, typically for for mates. So the males will raid another village. They will capture women and girls and bring them back. So he observed that the more aggressive males tended to reproduce more. And for him, this was evidence of selective force on human violence as a problem-solving tool. It was highly controversial. He was essentially censured by the American Anthropology Association for proposing this. And there was even I guess you would call him a journalist, but that's probably giving me too much credit. But he literally made up information to try to discredit Napoleon Chagnon, published a book, and there was a huge controversy around him because his conclusions essentially contradicted a lot of what cultural anthropologists argue, which is that culture is driving human behavior. So just speaking as an evolutionary biologist myself, I think it's trivially obvious that to some degree, human behaviors are driven by biology. If you look around the world, you will not find a single country in which violence is performed more by women than men. All right, it is everywhere you go. The data are clear on that. So that means that no matter what culture you look at, in every culture, males are more violent than females. So I think that at least at that course level, this is likely to be true. And if you look at this is just I just was able to download these data sort of easily for violent crimes. Males in the United States, all right, are far disproportionate for the violent crimes. But if you look at the non-violent crimes, so fraud, theft, embezzlement, there isn't that level of difference. So it's not that men are somehow morally inferior to women overall necessarily. It's that for violent crime, males are disproportionately guilty of those offenses. Now, because we're talking about biology, it's important that I mention that we are talking about variation. So there are continua, right? There are likely to be biologically differences between males and females in something as coarse as aggression, and we'll just whatever metric you care to measure that. That doesn't mean that there's not substantial overlap in that. So that's a picture of Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was a famous Ukrainian Soviet sniper during World War II. She killed 308 Germans. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about her. So it's clear that she would fall to the far end. You know, she exceeded the average male aggression. So there is overlap in here, and I'm just talking about coarse levels of difference, right? So I just want to emphasize that. All right, so this genetic predisposition towards aggression in males, probably genetic. There are also other genetic aspects to behavior. So long versus short-term planning. Some of you are probably familiar with the Stanford marshmallow experiment, where they took a bunch of kids and they put them in front of a marshmallow and they said, if you can wait 15 minutes, you'll get a second marshmallow. And just 15 minutes. And virtually none of the kids were able to wait. And this is probably genetically determined. And they do similar experiments on chimps and other primates, they essentially do the same thing. None of them can delay gratification. And you can see this in all manner of human behaviors. So credit card debt in the United States, as soon as they relax restrictions on credit card requirements, debt far outstrips income almost immediately because people are making poor short-term versus long-term decisions. And that's probably because in our evolutionary history, the idea of the future in some sense didn't exist. So if you take Homo erectus and say, we're going to try to select on long-term decision-making, they had no ability to know what was in the future. Like the further you go out beyond a few days, essentially you could know nothing. So there's probably no way for natural selection to actually operate on long-term decision making. It's clear that it does in some animals. There are animals that cache food, for example. There are animals that delay reproduction. So cicadas in the United States, we have this insect called the cicada, delays reproduction for as long as 7 years. So in some animals in which the future is probably more reliable or predictable, they're able to act on longer term decision making. But for humans, that's just not the case, and that applies now as well as in the past. So if you ask a human now, do you want a coal mining job, or is it important to have coal mining jobs, even at the expense of pollution in the future? The majority of humans will say yes, right? That they are just operating on this short-term decision. I need the job now, and I'm going to worry about the future in the future. And it's worth also mentioning that we no longer live in the environment in which we evolved. So, and we're likely to be maladapted to our present environment. So each one of those bars is 1,000,000 years, and so I represent that little red line. So that's how long we have been essentially, we have had complex societies. Before that, we were hunter-gatherers, and so that little black line, the black vertical line, that's about 250,000 years. So that's roughly the age of our species. But we lived as hunter-gatherers essentially all the way back at 7 million years. So most of our instincts and the underlying drivers of our behaviors evolved a long time ago in a very, very different environment. And it's unlikely that for most of our behaviors that selection has been able to change anything about those behaviors. So I thought I'd talk about war just because when we talk about history, this is sort of the biggest, most obvious series of events that we see. Oops, what's going on here? It's not going. So organized violence is pretty ancient as far as we can tell. So you can go back and look. So this is, if you ever have a chance to go to LA and go to the Getty Villa, these are these friezes from the Neo-Assyrians, and you can see there's all kinds of violent unpleasantness going on there, right? And it goes back in time. So you can go back to 10,000 years and look at hunter-gatherers. So on the right, you see this skeleton. This is a body, one of many, a group of them actually, where their hands were tied and their heads were bashed in. So this appears to be war captives. These would have been hunter-gatherers, not in complex societies. So this is organized violence on a reasonably large scale for their population size. So it goes back essentially as far as we can find humans. You can even go back to Shanidar 3, which is a Neanderthal. It has this cut through its rib that appears to have been made by a modern human Paleolithic point. So maybe it goes back as far as that. And when we look at chimpanzees, right? So chimpanzees engage in behavior that we would regard as both murder and warfare and genocide, as a matter of fact. So chimpanzees will organize to overthrow a dominant male, and they will often just kill them. But also they will go on patrol and kill all of the male members of the adjacent group, and then bring the females in, right? So this type of behavior is very, very deep in our past. Now, what's interesting is that this idea of using force to solve problems, it exists throughout nature, right? And it's commonly seen, for example, in males competing for access to females. But what's interesting is that if you look at all of the other animals, and you can look at gorillas or orangutans or zebras or any of these animals, right? They don't actually kill each other. They will fight until one has established that he is the stronger, right? And then it ends, right? The loser walks away injured, but usually doesn't die. So this idea of con-specific killing is, I don't want to say unique, but it is semi-unique, right, in our lineage. So chimpanzees and us. And people have looked at this and have argued that there probably are deep genetic proscriptions on conspecific killing, and those can be overcome under very specific circumstances. So David Grossman wrote this book on killing, and he examined. They looked at the muskets at Gettysburg, and they found that the majority of muskets were never fired. In fact, they were loaded multiple times. They found muskets with like 10 mini-ball gunpowder sequences and had never been discharged. And he and other psychiatrists have argued that there is this this reluctance to kill your own species. And you can imagine that that there would be genetic reasons for this, because when you are a hunter-gatherer, almost everyone you know is related to you. So, you are in a sense killing some part of your gene pool when you kill other members of your own species. Now, there have been ways that societies have developed to overcome this reluctance. And so what they do typically is establish something called an outgroup. So you find some group that is not part of your group, and they would be more genetically distant, and therefore it is more acceptable to kill them. And so this is the Hatfields and the McCoys, but there are lots of examples of them throughout history where we identify outgroups, right? It could be a soccer club, right? So if you have a different soccer club, we are going to probably not kill you, although it has happened at times. But then you can pick any variety of identifiers as you're in group to establish outgroups. So it could be religion, language, skin color, other cultural markers, right, that identify in groups and out groups that allow you to essentially use violent aggression, perhaps lethal, against that other group. So you see this a lot in dictators. So this is establishing the in-group right here. And of course, you probably all familiar with the fascists. They would pick out groups, right? Whether it was a racial or linguistic or national group or religious in the case of Franco, right? So those were in groups and out groups. And that allowed you to do things to that out group because you have established a distance from them. And we did it in the West as well. So this is essentially what propaganda is trying to create an outgroup so that you overcome your reluctance to engage in violence against them. And we see that, today, right? Now, there are some evolutionary aspects to this that might relate to the size of our brains. So some people have argued that you actually have to be able to have a theory of mind. You have to know what is in the intention of the other members in your group to have this coalitionary warfare, which might be why you tend to see it in chimps and humans under certain circumstances, because other animals don't have that, right? So they don't have theory of mind. And we can talk maybe about things like dolphins and whether or not they have that. But right, and so Jane Goodall said, right, this is essentially necessary. She also argued that consciousness is necessary for organized violence, right? So you have to know what the other members of your group are thinking so that you can act in this organized way. And so when we look at, things like violence or slavery, these things are universal. You establish an outgroup and you are able to conduct whatever sort of atrocious behavior this is. And so this is slavery, not necessarily killing, but it's essentially the same thing. You have an outgroup and you are then able to exploit them in some way. Okay? And as far as we know, slavery is a universal human behavior. There was an archaeologist at the University of Colorado that went back and looked at every society that she could find that was documented, and then basically up until the 19th century, the turn of the 19th century, there was no society that had not been a slave society at some point. All right, so having mentioned this, or having sort of explained that there are biological underpinnings for something like war, I wanted to just talk about evolutionary models for war in more specific. So there are essentially two models that have been proposed for war: mate acquisition and defense, and resource acquisition, right? And it is the mate acquisition is on the part of males, and this is due to the fact that I'm sure this group already knows this, that there is a disparity between reproductive potential for males and females in vertebrates, generally speaking, especially mammals. So males can have a lot of offspring or very few offspring, depending on access to mates, right? So a male can essentially reproduce as many times as he can mate. So theoretically, thousands, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of times. Whereas a female in a vertebrate, because she's limited into the number of offspring that she can gestate and give birth to, especially in mammals, she will have a smaller potential number, right? And so the constraint on the female is not access to the male. The constraint on the female is access to resources. So males act in ways to increase their access to females. Females act in ways to increase their access to resources, right? So this is sort of well understood in mammals, right? Now, it depends very much on what the females are doing. There's a range of behaviors, sort of social behaviors in primates, for example. Primates can be monogamous, primates can be polygynous, and it entirely depends on how the females map themselves to the environment. If the females are more evenly distributed across the environment, for a male to reproduce, he basically has to pick one male, and they become, like I say, monogamous, but they pair bond, right? So the two of them, basically because the male can't access multiple females. If the females congregate around a resource, as they do in gorillas, then a large male can essentially drive other males away. So this is the driving underlying factor, is the way the resources are distributed across the landscape that the females map themselves onto. The males then map themselves onto the resources. So I'm sure this is all a review for you, right? So, and this goes in primates and herding animals, all kinds of animals, all right? But this instinct for aggression to acquire mates is probably the driver of something like the Yanomamo. And in their case, it's pretty explicit. They say that we are going to an adjacent village, we are going to kill, if necessary, the males there or drive them away and acquire access to the female resources, right? The female reproduction. But this is also the case in warfare throughout history. So in pre-modern warfare, um, the ability of the male soldiers to sexually assault the females of the losers in the battle was essentially acknowledged, right? So whether you're talking about under Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan or the siege of Constantinople, in all of these cases, this was understood to be the consequence of winning and losing the war, and it factored in, right, to the decision making of both the males and the females. We'll talk about the males now. We'll talk about the females in a little bit, right? And the sort of big example that people have used is Genghis Khan, who essentially raped his way across Asia. And geneticists have identified these markers that they think indicate descent from Genghis Khan. So you're talking 1 in 12, right? So he would have been the ancestor of millions and millions of people in Asia because he was raping someone different every day, or maybe multiple people. And what's interesting is that politicians seem to be aware of this. So this connection between warfare and sexual access for males, right? This is a thing that politicians play on. So this is a poster from the Vietnam War in which people were promoting the idea that not going to war, that contradicting the natural instinct is the way to get access to females. And you also see this in some of the propaganda in World War II. So this is Axis propaganda leaflets dropped over the Allied lines. And the idea is that you are losing sexual access to your mates by being away at the war. So they were playing on this idea very directly. And I would actually, and not just I, other people have argued as well, that in post-Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction South, that was one of the drivers of a lot of the aggressive violence is this idea for, well, people sort of exploited this idea that the Southern males were afraid that they were going to lose access to their mates. And a lot of the lynchings and other violence were essentially provoked by the fear that a black male was gaining access to a white female, and that was enough to provoke this kind of violence, right? And this can be seen as a very genetic instinct, and so it's provoked in this. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of this movie, Birth of a Nation. Sort of they exploit this idea that they're somehow protecting literally their gene pool, right? Their pool of mates, right? From the black men, and then it was reflected in some of the laws as well. So this new Virginia law to preserve racial integrity, it treats the gene pool of white females as something that could be polluted. In other words, like they're trying to keep other genes out of this single gene pool. All right. Now, this is talking about males. So, we're treating males as sort of the agents of this. This is not necessarily the case. Well, it is mostly the case for offensive wars because males have something to gain by going to war, right? So in a war, males might acquire access to additional females, right? So females, there is no or less incentive to do so because they are not going to gain um, really anything from an offensive war. However, when there's a defensive war, differences in instinct between male and female seem to disappear. And when they do studies on like females, how they feel about violence, when it's defensive violence, the differences between males and females largely disappear. And so, there are lots of instances of females going to war in defensive war. So you have Ukraine in the top left, you have Ludmilla again, and then the bottom right was the siege of Sarajevo. So, this does loosely follow biological models when we look at the differences in the instincts there, and this occurs in nature too. So if you want to have an interesting day, right, go out in the woods and mess with a bear cub, right, because there's really nothing more dangerous in nature than a mother bear protecting her gene pool. This actually just happened to a friend of mine. Last week I was visiting Wyoming, and a buddy of mine was running through the mountains there. He's just doing a jog, and he came around the corner, and there was mother bear and two female bears, right? And he knew instantly, like, his life was just hanging in the balance, right? And mother looked at him, and he kind of backed away, and fortunately, mother didn't kill him. But that happens a fair bit, right? And this is fairly consistent with biological models of, defense of the gene pool. Now, the other model that has been offered is resource acquisition, and this is essentially an extension of the other model in which males will gin up an effort to conquer territory, but the idea of conquering territory is essentially the same thing. You are acquiring resources with the understanding that when you acquire those resources, this will help you increase your reproductive success, right? And so we have these empires throughout history, and I, as a biological anthropologist, tend to treat all of these empires as instances of essentially the same thing, even though there are important differences between them all. They do tend to follow similar patterns, right? Where you are trying to capture territory and capture the resources for your group for that territory. And it's fairly explicit in the case of the Lebensraum in World War II, in which they were trying to eliminate people in Ukraine so that they could literally put people who share their gene pool in those areas, right? So that is sort of the big course outline for how we think about war. Now, I want to talk a little bit about internal politics, just a little bit. So it's probably, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but it's probably understood that males that will attempt to acquire resources within societies because it helps them acquire more mates or more successfully acquire mates. So the more resources that you have, and that's probably true. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. What I want to talk about is female choice a little bit. When you look at animals, in certain groups of animals, the males are more highly adorned, and you probably know that this is because females are choosing the males with that adornment, and that adornment is some sort of expression on behalf of the males of genetic health, or some variant of that. So the females will choose a brightly colored male because that means the male is strong, able to avoid predators, they have good genes, and this is, in nature, often females are making the choices about which males with whom they would like to mate, right? And this applies to primates as well, and even in complex societies like the chimps, right? The females do make some choices about the males, right? A lot of the institutions, and we can talk about the specifics, but it would be religion or tradition or the legal system, right? They are designed to constrain the abilities of women in these societies to make the rational choices, right, about which mates they choose. So child brides or harems, and all of those cases, the females are not allowed to make the choice, right, the rational choice about with whom they would like to mate, right? Divorce is another way of constraining the female's abilities to make a decision about their mates. If they are with a mate and the mate does not appear to be working out, right? In a lot of countries, it's very difficult for females to get a divorce. And in Islam, especially, the males can very easily divorce, but the females have to go through a much more complicated process and essentially get the males to acquiesce to that divorce, right? And contraception is another variation of this. So the Catholic Church, or in the United States, we had Anthony Comstock, always a villain in my book, right? Proscribing the ability of females to essentially regulate their own reproduction and make choices about that. And a lot of the history of feminism in the modern world is about women getting the ability to make the rational choice for themselves. All right. So it's land rights, voting rights, all of these things were, so especially in economics, if a woman can't own land, right, she is constrained in her ability to go out and make decisions, economic decisions, and make choice decisions. Right. And this, when we make laws that we regard as sort of enlightened, we are specifically often doing those because we perceive that women don't have free choice. So when polygamy was outlawed in Utah, one of the reasons we did that was because we perceived that those women were not really making choices for themselves, right? So they couldn't choose who their husband was going to be. Their families would marry them with some male, and the women were essentially, given to the men. And so we outlawed that with the idea, right? So this Enlightenment idea of giving women more power, to empower the women, right? And so this is a fairly recent case. This is 2001. This guy, Thomas Green, he was a polygamist living out in the Utah desert, actually not far from where I live. I'm in Las Vegas. So you can drive out in the desert and you can find people like that. And it's about half an hour away. And so he went to jail, right? So because we perceived that those women were not really operating with free choice. They were all younger than he was. They were all on welfare. He was collecting their welfare checks, and deciding how to spend it, right? But what's interesting is that this is, we are similarly constraining female free choice. So we would probably make a different judgment about that if Thomas Green was not collecting their welfare checks, but was wealthy and was able to actually reallocate resources. So, Derek Jeter, if you are Derek Jeter's fifth wife, you are much better materially than Brian Villmoare's first wife, I can assure you. So, this idea of free choice, we sort of, a lot of our political decisions are based on that, even if they're fairly coarse methods, right? Here's another one. So this is 2 instances in the United States in the last 25 or 30 years of much younger women marrying much older and much wealthier women. And our society judges those pairings fairly harshly. So, people view J. Howard Marshall as a dirty old man and Anna Nicole Smith as a gold digger. And this is the kind of judgment that people make, right? But from an evolutionary perspective, they both were making rational decisions. She acquired access to resources for her offspring, which she did use for her offspring. And he acquired access to a female sort of in the optimal reproductive window. So we do sort of make our laws and our moral judgments based on our perception, right, of whether or not the person went into it with free will. Because child marriage or child brides, like in Afghanistan, we judge that as not as a woman not having choice, as that girl not having choice. Whereas in this case, she probably did have choice, right? And you can see the way women make decisions about when they are given the opportunity to make free decisions. Um, it's pretty rational and follows evolutionary models. So on the left axis, you see this preference for women that women have for men with more resources than they have. So on the left axis, the higher you go on the left axis, the greater the preference is for someone more wealthy than you, a man more wealthy than you. And on the right axis is gender parity. And you can see in places like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, where women have essentially, well, maybe not completely, but more equal economic opportunity. They don't have to choose a man with more resources. But in places where they cannot, right? So Iran, for example, women just simply are not able to acquire the economic resources that the males are, right? It's rational for them to choose a male with more resources than they have to ensure the success of their offspring. So this maps, like you see in this graph. I like this graph because it's an interplay of cultural and biological factors. So you can see how those two things play off each other, right? All right, so how do we sort of mitigate? Let's just take it, right, that biology is driving us to do a bunch of, at least males, to do a bunch of violent things that pay off only in the short term. How do we mitigate against that, right? So when we look at something like world conflicts, right, it maps onto something like imperialism, and imperialism is often credited with creating violence in the modern world, or being responsible for violence in the modern world. But you can also look at other factors that I would argue are more underlying, more ultimate, rather less proximate. So this is a map of population density across the world. So where it's reddest, the population is the densest, or actually the purple is the densest, and then green, and then moving towards the gray, right? The less dense, right? Now this is resource density, right? So you'll notice that in this graph, Europe is very dense with people, but it is also very dense with resources, right? So if you, and I just downloaded these data off of the internet, if you look at a ratio of population density to resources and plot that against what they call the Fragility Index, which is a measure of things like corruption and violence in a society, those are fairly predictive, right? So when you look at a map of violence in the world, you can see that they tend to fall to the right side of this, right? So they have high population density and low resources, right? So, and there have been some instances in the past. If you look at that book Collapse by Jared Diamond, he talks about this, the Rwandan genocide. That was one of the most highly populated places in the world, and one of the lowest resources when the genocide occurred. And he argues, and I think persuasively, that all it took was just a little perturbation in the political climate of that country to create this genocide. And of course, it was Hutu against Tutsi, so it's in-group versus out-group. But his argument is that it was driven essentially by resource allocation. Now, what's driving the limited resources? Those are obviously political factors, but it's also reproduction, right? So these are places of the world with really high rates of reproduction. And we see this in the past too. So you can go back to 1315, and there were some fairly densely populated parts of the world. There was an environmental perturbation, and all of those, well, at least in the case of the American Southwest and Easter Island, those societies actually fully collapsed, and people had to move away. There was a period of great violence, and then the populations thinned out, because this is population density over resources. And as soon as you perturb the resources, for example, you will get violence in those cases. And it's fairly easy to predict, right? And so what about now? So that's in the past. What are we talking about now? So some of you are probably old enough to remember this book. My parents had it when I was a kid. This came out in the early 70s. I was 7 or something like that. My dad had a copy of this book, and I remember picking it up and thinking, huh, that doesn't look too good. And at the time, this guy, Paul Ehrlich, who is still alive incidentally, argued that population density in the world was going to create this huge famine. So he was arguing that hundreds of millions of people starved to death. Most of you probably remember that didn't occur. So why didn't it occur, right? Part of it is the West was able to increase resources. So we now produce far more corn per acre and other types of crops and food. So we do just keep increasing the resources. The other thing is that population is dropping off. So around the world, really, no matter where you go, even in those fairly highly dense places in developing countries, the population rates are still starting to decrease. And they argue by 2050, we will have a fairly steady decrease in world population. The actual population has not yet caught up with this trend quite yet, but the trajectory is fairly clear. So what causes this? Well, probably the number one thing is educating girls. As soon as you get girls in school, fertility rates drop off. So this may be the single most important change in the world over the last 100 years and over the next 100 years, is that you educate girls, population rates will decrease, and more you will have you will lose those places where you have really high population densities relative to resources. And this is, a product of the Enlightenment, which really didn't start, going until maybe the 19th century. But the trajectory on this is pretty clear. And when they look at, national, all kinds of measures of happiness, it's almost always in places where, right, females are able to control their reproduction and are driving down their reproduction, right? So this is a fairly clear driver, right? The other thing is the evolutionary horizon of decision making. When we talk about that, right? So the question is whether governments can make it so that people are able to make decisions without essentially being punished by external circumstance. In the United States, if you lose your job, well, up until 2014, if you lost your job, you were likely to lose your health care. Right now, Obama fortunately introduced this national health care, but for a long time, and it still sort of factors into American decision making. When you lose your job, you do lose your health care, right? Which means that it's very difficult to make more intelligent long-term decisions about things like employment, because you're going to lose something so valuable in the short term. I mean, in the medium term. So there are things that we can do to try to mitigate that, so we can shift away from that, right? So when people lose their job in the coal mine, there will be healthcare and another job available for them, right? And so countries that have buffers for individuals when they make individual decision making, they seem to make better long-term decisions, or at least I would argue they make better long-term decisions. And if you want instances of that, I'm sort of running out of time, but we can talk about that. The other thing is democracy, right? So democracy didn't really exist until whatever, the turn of the 18th century. Today, there's a lot of democracy. There's a trend towards increasing democracy, although it's a fairly jagged line, as you know, if you look at history. In general, democracies tend not to go to war against each other, right? Historians have observed this. So the trend towards increasing numbers of democracies will tend to push down. Part of this, well, Putin obviously being an exception, part of this is because democracies tend not to be driven by in-group and out-group identification, right? So they're a little bit more philosophically driven. So this is John McCain. I don't know if you know who John McCain was. He was an American politician. He was a Republican and fairly conservative, and he died during the Trump administration. And he had this read over his casket, literally, because Trump was sort of appealing to a fairly nationalistic instinct within the United States. And John McCain wanted to argue that the United States should not and was not that we are a more philosophically, or should be a more philosophically driven society, and driven less by in-group, out-group. And so the more democracy you have, you tend to have fewer wars, right? So there has been a trend downward in big wars over the last couple of 100 years as the world has become more democratic. The other thing is that in democratic countries, you tend to have a trend towards less, obviously not no, but less inequality between the sexes. And what does that do for us? When we have less inequality between the sexes, we have more women politicians. So right now we have the most, and this is actually not up to date, but the most women leaders of world countries, more than we've ever had in the history of the world, right? And if women are in charge of those countries, it's less likely that they will be nationalistic and driven by in-group, out-group, but also less likely they will engage in offensive wars. Now, this is a tendency. This is not a universal, right? But we expect there to be, generally speaking, more world peace the more women are in leadership positions around the world, because males have that instinct towards violent aggression and the more in-group, out-group behavior, and women have less of that. So this is sort of a trend that we're obviously hoping continues to some extent, right? And just to put this back into biology, right? Bonobos are matriarchal, and this is the way they handle that, right? And they are the less violent of the chimps. So we talk about chimps, we see violence, we see bonobos, we see less violence, and this seems to bear out, right, our evolutionary predictions. So I'm just going to leave this up here. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to stop now and answer any questions you might have. I'm sorry, I apologize for speaking over.
No problem, Brian. That was really interesting. Thanks very much. You start with sociobiology and end up with feminism. That was fantastic. Anyone like to ask a question of Brian? By the way, I apologize for getting your university wrong. I mixed up Arizona with Nevada. I've been to both, so I have no excuse. So sorry for that error.
No, Arizona's got where I got my PhD. So if you Google me, you may see me in Arizona. I don't know.
Okay. The other Brian Smith, if you'd like to raise a question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I really enjoyed that. I was wondering if you see any policies or behaviours now in society that seem to run directly counter to our, if like the evolutionary biological drives of our behaviour. Things that, well, that won't work because that's just not the way we're built.
Sure. I mean, economics is full of that. So, for example, people's instincts are to acquire resources. So, if you try to imply sort of the big Marxist model, one of the reasons it fails is because that's fairly contrary to human instinct, I think. Humans are naturally competitive. They want to acquire resources. You need to incentivize them to do things, right? Using incentives that come from our evolutionary past, like resources. So I don't think you can just tell people to be just say, oh, you should be, work for the great of the party. I don't think that will work. And that's one of the reasons I think Marxism fails. It's because it doesn't understand humans.
Thanks. Dick Langlois. Dick.
Yeah, let me see if I can get this to work. You mentioned economics just now, and I sort of wanted to offer the perspective of an economic historian. I've taught European, although actually it's world economic history for a long time, and you had a number of things up there. You graphed something against GDP against population density, and then you talked about the number of girls who were educated and so on. And many economic historians would say, well, there's actually something driving both of those things. That first of all, you didn't need to have GDP versus population density. All you needed was GDP versus population. That is, what's really driving everything here is economic growth. Right. So you could tell your whole story as a story of economic growth. The wealthier, I mean, we could discuss that, right? But the wealthier people are, the less they're going to engage in these kinds of activities. And even educating girls is probably highly correlated with and caused by economic growth, right? I mean, it's a wavy line maybe, but and population decline is being caused by economic growth because the wealthier people are, the higher the opportunity cost is of having children. So people are going to have fewer children. And generally, the view of economic historians towards Jared Diamond is that we love Jared Diamond. That was path breaking, but the sociobiological story kind of breaks down just about the time that advanced civilization starts to happen, and then you get something else that's much more important than sociobiology, which is institutions. And so institutions that lead to economic growth get all the good things that you want, and institutions that don't lead to economic growth get all the bad things, right? Get all the bad things that you don't want. And this is a little bit of a challenge to you, that many economic historians would say once we get to that era, sociobiology is less interesting for explaining these things than social institutions. And just one other very small point, you talked about incentives and so on, taking advantage of our natural instincts, but there's many of us have written that there's a sense in which modern institutions are very unnatural, right? And that's why they're so difficult to keep in place. So democracy, or maybe far more important, liberalism, are refractory to all that sociobiology that you have talked about, right? Because we evolved in hunter-gatherer societies, and so now we want to think of large societies the same way we used to think about hunter-gatherer societies, right? So we'll put somebody in charge, will be a king, powerful dictator, and then tell people what to do, set prices, tell them what they should do. And in fact, that's the institutions that seem to work best are ones that are very refractory to that, where people don't behave, right, and have to understand that they can no longer behave the way they did as hunter-gatherers.
Yes. So, okay, there's a lot there. I'll just sort of start with the first. We talk about population density. I think there are poor countries that have low population density that don't engage in conflict, right? I mean, like it is not. Yes, poverty is part of the picture, but there are plenty of poor societies that aren't violent. And I would argue that it's competition for resources, and we can discuss that. But that, obviously with more money, there's less competition for resources. But I think that for me anyway, the underlying driver is that the relative density of the resources, right? And then, yes, so institutions, right? So some of them work against our instincts, some of them work with. And that explains some of the success or failure of them. I'm sure you can put your camera back up. We can talk about this, but like Richard Thaler, he what he did was he made it so that employees had to co-opt out of their retirement. So in other words, he didn't give them the chance to make the choice about whether they were going to make the long-term or short-term decisions. So he understood that they were going to make poor long and short-term decisions. And he said, I'm going to take that away from you, and I'm going to put it away. We're going to make the long-term decision because the institution is able to do that, even though the individual in the aggregate is not. And so that's kind of my view about successful institutions, is it does constrain the instincts that we have that are negative. Democracy, I think, does the same thing. So I do think that there's an instinct for individuals to try to acquire power and acquire resources individually. And one of the great insights of the Enlightenment was that we need to constrain that we can't succumb to that underlying instinct, which is biological, I would argue, but tends to lead to disproportionate amounts of power in the hands of some versus the hands of others. So there is a tension, I guess, is the way I feel about it, is that we do need to constrain our instincts.
It's all about constraint. We could talk a lot more. Let somebody else.
Yeah, right.
Marion.
Your speaker, your microphone's off.
Yeah. Marion, put your mic on, please, and we'll hear you then. We can see you. Marion, you need to put your mic on. We can't hear you.
I found it, I think.
There we go. That's
I
it.
hear you now. Yeah, great.
Okay, sorry. I enjoyed
Sure.
that very much. A great long story, but it's a very biological story about human history. I could start back with those baby turtles, for example. It's obvious that they don't learn by observation from their parents where to go, because they do it completely independently. But I'll bet if you did some experimenting with them, there'd be some trial and error involved there. Individual learning. If they bumped into a stone, they'd learn how to go around stones or something, and so on and so forth. And then some of the biology was a little bit simplified, like female choice for ornaments as being for health. I think you summarized. I published a theory of sexual selection, which is much more detailed and sophisticated than that. You may or may not be aware that centrioles are inherited through males in animals, and they do a lot of different things. And one is they nucleate the cytoskeleton, so that can be for maintenance. They provide motility, obviously, in terms of sperm and other things with the tail. So that can account for choice for songs, dances, nuptial flights, and so on. And finally, they determine the plane of cell division. And so they can be responsible for the lovely negative image symmetry that is there in vertebrates. And the colors just maybe all drawing attention to the lovely symmetry. And if they're nicely symmetrical outside, then they're probably nicely symmetrical inside. So there's a lot more sophisticated biological versions. Anyway, I really enjoyed the whole thing, taking me all the way back to E.O. Wilson. I wrote a review of sociobiology when it was first published, when I was a graduate student, and it was the first thing I ever published.
Uh, well, yeah, I wouldn't argue about like I because of the audience, I tended to simplify, female mate choice just to show mostly that there is female mate choice, which I think is overlooked a lot of times. So, and it's an important driver in humans, which people for some reason don't, talk about too much.
Question on that, Brian. I know the argument, and I agree with it from my unqualified perspective, that amongst other animals, the vividly colored, the more attractive male indicates females doing the choice. How would you explain the fact that amongst humans, females spend a lot more time, on average, concerned about their appearance and probably more money, I think, on most expenditure service than males do? Does that mean the choice is inverted, that men are doing the choice for cultural reasons?
No, it's true that females do compete because we're in a sort of a mixed society. So, there is reason for females to compete for the best males, and they do that in chimps. Females will engage in behaviors to compete for the best male. They'll do certain things to provoke, competition. So the strongest male will be interested in her. So that's. But if you compare, pick your whatever you're talking about, like makeup or clothing, and you compare that to climbing Everest or building the Eiffel Tower, I think it's clear that males are competing far, far more through their behaviors for women than women are competing for men. I mean, I think that's the underlying behavior behind every Ferrari that's ever been sold, every Rolex that's ever been sold. I mean, you just go on right on down the line.
Well, that's confirmed by the advertising of those commodities, isn't it? They often, well, at least traditionally, have used female models and so on.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they're they closely link those to reproduction.
Okay, there's nobody else. I'll ask another question. Well, it's really a remark rather than a question. I loved I heard the data. I've seen the data before, but never in such a vivid way about girls in school and population growth. I mean, Amartya Sen is my source on that because he talks about that in regard to India. India has a lower rate of population growth in some states, which implement such a policy of empowering women, reach lower levels of population growth than, for example, China did under the most restrictive plays, which is an authoritarian mechanism for controlling family size. I think that should be blasted all over the internet because we have this very important debate about climate change, which you mentioned at the end. And everyone says, well, it's greedy capitalists and it's markets and it's profit motive. Well, it's all that's true. But also population growth is a problem. And I think a lot of the climate change activists, which I'm in favor of activity against climate change, but they just won't look at the elephant in the room, which is population growth. And I think if you look at the elephant in the room and you put up your graph next to that and say, well, there is a solution, as Amartya Sen has argued, as I said, then I think that's a very important thing. And I think that's your kind of argument is a way of putting that on the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, as the father of two daughters, this is like something I think about quite a bit. I guess the main constraint is in some cultures that empowers women in a way that threatens men. In other words, because that teaches women more about what they might do in a society, gives them choices that the males might not want them to have. The Taliban just outlawed education above 5th grade or something for all girls and women. And as far as I'm concerned, this is exactly why they did it. They do not want women to be in a position to make the choices.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm getting at a different problem. The problem I'm getting at is that even in more egalitarian, developed Western societies, where there's more gender equality and more rights for women, quite rightly, is still not discussed. Population growth is still a taboo subject. And your analysis suggests it's really important.
Well, I actually think that it's interesting. Some economists have said that the decrease in population growth has a problem. So if you look at Japan, for example, like population, they're in negative population growth. I mean, there are several countries like that, right? So Hong Kong,
Italy,
yeah, right. So they're in negative population growth, and people are worrying about the economic consequences. That there won't be enough young people to support the old people. I was like, you're getting it all wrong. Like, we need to be encouraging every country to be doing this. I mean, I think it's right. I mean, yeah, that is the number one thing we need to be doing. In general, the trends are in the right direction, I would say. It's just hard to convince people. You can't go to someone and say, don't have babies. That goes against every biological, well, not every, but a lot of your biological instincts are to reproduce. I mean, you want to look your grandkid in the eye and say, oh, I see myself. And so you have to figure out some way to attenuate that instinct. But I am a big believer in population control. No question.
Well, I mean, it can be voluntary, can't it?
Well, it is. I mean, I think all those places it is. The only place it's not would have been China in the past. So Italy and Japan, they're just deciding not to have kids, and that if we can figure out what ways we can encourage that in other societies, then we'll go a long way, right?
Yeah. Okay, another question I think squeeze in. What do you think of dual inheritance theory, Boyd and Richardson and so on?
Can I say no comment on that? Is that okay?
Yeah, if you wish.
Okay. All right.
We allow that kind of answer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll say no comment on that.
Yeah. Okay. But they've been responsible for introducing discussions about the role of genetic drivers in all sorts of contexts. So,
right.
And I mean, it's just quite, their work is quite path breaking in many ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I sometimes just hang back and watch how the debates unfold before I try to make too many decisions about what.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of the debate is whether you insist or not on bringing everything ultimately down to the genes.
Yeah. I tend to function at the level of the organism, not the gene. But that's just, because that's the operational level. In other words, you can make arguments, and those are sort of quantitative genetics arguments, which is why I don't really feel qualified to say, one or the other. Just my my instinct is that the organism is the operational level, and therefore we should be thinking about it at that level.
Okay. So what about group selection?
No, I'm not a group selection guy.
Okay.
I think
some of us are, but we're very open to discussion about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think things occur that group selection occurs as a phenomenon, but it's a product of selection at the level of the individual. That's sort of how I stand on that.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. It's great. Before we wrap up, anybody like to ask another question? No. Well, thanks for your time, Brian. It's been a really stimulating talk. I mean, I really admire the way you brought it up to modern issues like war and peace and economic development and climate change and all that stuff. And it's really quite inspiring in the way that you did that. And thanks very much. There's lots of things to discuss and sort out. And why not? You can join this. You're in this forum. You're welcome to participate. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. The reason you don't see me too often is because your talks are like
Yeah.
3 in the morning, and it's hard for me to to arrange the time.
Time zones are institutional constraint.
Yeah. If only the Earth were flat, we wouldn't have to worry about it.
Exactly. Yes. Well, some people believe that, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
A virtual clap for a great talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I appreciate the invitation very much.
Okay. Great. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.